Hey there, Hetty here. We talk about nurturing our solitary practices often enough as a community. I want to chat a bit about one way each of us can fall on our faces, namely by half-assing our way through our craft. I think it's one of the pitfalls of operating outside of the purview of another's authority, and of working within a structure in which we will repeatedly butt up against the limits of our own capacities. When we run face first into a wall, there will rarely, if ever, be a definitively enlightened source around to lend us a hand over it or tell us what we're missing. Developing productive reactions to these events is a learned skill, one that takes effort and repeated practice itself. And when you haven't got a human authority figure to expect or even demand that you develop that skill, then you have little option but to rely on your own gumption to propel you toward the barrier you're facing, and hopefully past it. Even those of us who are highly self-driven aren't good at holding ourselves accountable 100% of the time. Pushing yourself to tackle something difficult or that requires some drudgery can be like trying to pull your own teeth out without anesthetic. I've certainly found myself in this position on more than a couple of occasions, engaging in positively fucking epic periods of procrastination when faced with tasks that I consider boring necessities or that seem too big or complex to tackle competently in one go. Several of these times, my saving grace has been a looming deadline that, ready or not, finally kicked my ass into gear. As I'm pretty sure all of you can attest, getting going and keeping oneself on task over days and weeks is even harder when there are no external expectations to drive us. In the absence of external authority, there's no one to call you out if you decide to cave under the self-imposed pressure and give up. No one but yourself to challenge your claim of, whatever, this is good enough. No one but you to notice when the occasional episode of fucking off turns into a lifestyle, and that the self-appeasing lie of, it's fine, I'll do it later, it hardly matters anyway, becomes the common refrain. And that's the kiss of spiritual death. Because unfortunately, it isn't enough to merely scratch the surface of a spiritual skill or topic and declare oneself learned and experienced. Reading about something for a day isn't enough to make us a master, nor typically is sitting around thinking of rituals we should do or want to do, or the devotionals we intend to say, and the path working we'll get around to one day. There aren't a lot of things I'm dead certain of when it comes to my craft, but I'm as sure as I can be that on the path I've chosen, a lack of concerted effort cannot be made up for. The good stuff, the really awesome experiences and outcomes, have proven to rely on experience and immersion, on regular practice. More than anything else, I think these truths lie at the heart of my craft. So we can soften the language all we want, but flaking on the work is ultimately failing. In my own mind, I am only the witch I think myself to be, so long as I practice my craft with the diligence and effort I've come to expect of myself. Now, here's the part where I mention that the term witch doesn't belong to anybody, and that others attempt to regulate how people use it based on their own particular sets of beliefs and standards strikes me as little more than a self-aggrandizing exercise designed to soothe immature egos. I've tried to be careful in how I use the word here to reflect this, but if it hasn't been clear, let me state now for the record that I do not believe that people who take different approaches to witchcraft aren't really witches. They may not be the same sort of witch as me, but anybody who wants to borrow the general term witch, just as I have, just as we all have, has as much right as anybody else. The way I apply the word to myself within my own practice has no bearing whatsoever on whether somebody with entirely different mores and expectations should apply it to what they do. Having said that, we each also have more personal, more stringent ideas of what constitutes being the sort of witch we wish to be. This personal conception dictates how we measure our development within our own practices and our sense of self. It also dictates what is required of us to live up to that conception, be it regular ritual working toward and achieving a consistent sense of universal connection, or the mastery of particular skills. So while nobody else has cause to fall in line with our own vision of what witchcraft is, failing to try to live up to our own expectations is, bluntly, letting oneself down. And this remains true even while there are legitimately many valid ways for people to practice witchcraft. Because you are not people. You are you. And you don't really practice that general and far-reaching thing called witchcraft. You and I practice a much narrower personal path that may fall under the umbrella term witchcraft, but which has on its own a more stringently defined set of philosophies, acts, and rules of behavior. The existence of a multitude of varied paths, some of which may indeed require less concerted effort or time than the path we each privately attempt to follow, does not mean that anything goes for you or I as well. Therefore, just because I have no right or desire to demand that others engage with witchcraft the way I do, does not in turn mean that I shouldn't make that demand of myself. In fact, I must, because I'm the only one who can, and the onus of honest evaluation falls to me. In the end, being too laissez-faire in this regard is as toxic as being impossibly hard on oneself. Each of us will reap the rewards or chaff in direct proportion to our willingness to engage with our practice honestly, and our ability to hold ourselves accountable for the work we do or don't. If we don't even try or consistently hold back during the attempt, then we are absolutely failing at being the kind of witch we aspire to be. And regardless of how convincing a lie we try to tell ourselves, some part of us will know that we've been cutting corners and will remain keenly aware of the lackluster rewards it's bought us. On an ego-placating level, consistently failing to do the work you've privately decided you ought to may result in becoming genuinely disheartened, maybe even confused as to why none of the so-called solitary paths to enlightenment ever seem to pay off long-term. A person may even begin believing that the problem is the path itself, rather than the more difficult to admit possibility that the real issue is their repeated half-assed 100-foot treks down that path and the subsequent U-turns back to base camp. Nobody else can strip you of the title of witch. But you can do that. And if you half-ass it long enough, you probably will. In fact, I suspect that an even worse experience is to be perceived as solidly spiritual by others while we ourselves have secretly come to believe we're full of shit. So on that note, I want to come back around to the idea of external expectations as aids to keep us in line, because many of us will, at some point, attempt to get around a lack of motivation by recruiting outside actors who we hope will keep us in check. It's a topic I think particularly relevant to content producers. The online pagan community is, on the whole, pretty damned accepting of those who provide content, and loath to impose stringent standards on those who've decided to share their experiences and insights free of charge. And that's as it should be. I think the benefits of this tendency massively outweigh the drawbacks. Most content producers aren't making money in exchange for what they do, after all. Most aren't receiving any sort of tangible recompense for the considerable time they spend putting together and distributing content. So it would be pretty damned presumptuous for those of us who benefit from that willingness to freely share content to nitpick every flaw and limitation. Nor do I think producing content means we have to voluntarily and necessarily open up our spiritual paths to democratic review and oversight. Sod that. But nevertheless, I think that the unjudgmental positive feedback content producers receive can, at times, lead to crises of confidence that undermine their practices. By publicly sharing our thoughts, ideas, and workings, we are, in a way, recruiting an external source of motivation and accountability. We're placing upon our practices an external expectation that we do things we talk about doing, that we push forward, that we live up to the particular ideas and images we've publicized and vocally thrown our lot in with. Only our viewers can't hold us accountable, because they can't see if we're doing the work or walking the talk. And they, you guys, and me too, because I also watch plenty of other people's channels, we're trusting. We'll offer support in response to those content providers' claims of effort and study, because of course we will. We viewers are, in other words, not cut out for the task some content producers seem to hope will fill, or perhaps even rely on us to fill. And being let down by our support systems, even those support systems that don't really exist and never knew they were supposed to be supporting anyone, that can feel catastrophic. The same problem, the same outcomes, holds true for those of us who don't produce content in the form of blogs or videos, but who nevertheless maintain social contacts in the community, whether it's via Facebook groups or circles of friends who likewise practice the craft. In either case, we are producing content in the form of communication, and there will inevitably be those of us who gradually lean on those venues for identity and a sense of achievement. But that achievement is in many ways illusory, even if the attention it garners is rewarding. As for the identity it serves to prop up, that's one that exists primarily outside of ourselves, and which confers little, if anything, in the way of personal spiritual growth. The distinction isn't always apparent at first, and I suspect that we've all had a friend or two who've become talkers first and practitioners second, then practitioners third, then fourth, then not at all, because nobody they're relying on for support is actually looking over their shoulder to make sure they're living up to their claims and aspirations. And their interactions with those people have gradually become an image managing exercise that takes up so much of their effort that half-assing their practice is all they've got time for anymore. Eventually, they may drop the actual practice entirely without telling anyone, and behold, nobody they were unconsciously counting on to notice and care will even realize, leaving them with the question of, why am I even bothering anymore? My worst efforts are indistinguishable from my best, and maybe that's the real truth here. I understand why people feel this way when faced with this situation. I nevertheless think that they're reaching the wrong conclusion, because it is, in a way, easier than accepting responsibility for flunking out of their self-designed curriculum of study. Happily, unlike college courses, it costs nothing to re-enroll, and our final GPA won't take a hit if we only pass on our second or third try. But to do so, it's crucial to keep in mind that the capacity to remain motivated while pursuing a personal spiritual practice isn't some mystical, intangible mystery. It simply depends upon believing that there are actually rewards to be had, and that with enough work, we are entirely capable of attaining those goals on our own. Part and parcel of this is the necessary belief that there is more to discover, more to experience than what we have thus far, and that we're not just lying to ourselves about the existence of those discoveries and those experiences. Honesty with ourselves and about ourselves will help guard against this fate. Conversely, it should come as no surprise when fundamental doubts surface if one has made a habit to lie to oneself over the course of months of false starts and half-hearted effort. I realize that some of what I've said sounds like I'm trying to take people to task for half-assing it, or that I'm personally offended by them doing so, but honestly, I'm not. It has no impact on me directly, and I sure as hell am not one of the people anybody else should be counting on to keep them on the straight and narrow, or to point out when I think that they're flaking. For that, I really would have to be paid. And even then, beyond cutting the check, they would still owe me nothing. I am not now, nor will I, or anybody else, ever be owed explanations for others' private spiritual decisions. But neither do others owe me their efforts or active concern. Which means that a solitary practice must be able to stand alone as a solitary endeavor, through and through. So no, the things I've described here aren't accusations that can be levied against another person, because we can't know the truth of another's practice and cannot determine the quality of their engagement or the returns on their investments unless they choose to tell us about them. And even then, it's none of our fucking business. But if somebody comes to me and asks for advice, or if any of you listening have felt yourself sliding down this particular slope, my advice is this. For the love of all that's holy, do yourself the favor of being answerable to yourself. Admit what it is you really expect of yourself and of what it is you really want. Then do it. If you've lied to yourself in the past, do yourself the biggest solid of your life and come clean to yourself about it. Stop lying and forgive yourself for both those past lies you've told and the occasional fib your future self will tell when it feels cornered. Take some time to try to figure out why you've been lying to yourself, what truth you think you're protecting yourself from that you won't like. Think about what aspects of yourself are ones you've come to distrust. What is coloring their perceptions or trying to reshape yours? Do this at least once before you give up on being the witch you want to be. Or, don't. It's entirely up to you. Until next time, I wish you the best.